Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Samechtet. Malaka bismol or balayda. The Mishnah taught that if a kohen takes a consecrated bird and he does milika with his left hand, or at night, that milika is improper, and therefore the korban will be an invalid korban. You cannot continue with the sacrifice. Nevertheless, even though that milika is not sufficiently proper to make it a good sacrifice, nevertheless, it is called milika in some sense. It's sufficient to make it not tameh. If you have a bird that is killed as a nebela, let's say you stab it to death, so now that is called nebela. And the pasuk says that a nebela will cause tum'ah. That's true of animals, it's also true of a bird. Whereas animals cause tum'ah by anyone touching or carrying it, a bird that is as nebela only causes tum'ah if it's in someone's throat. While it's in one's throat, it causes tum'ah to the person and to any clothing he's wearing or anything he touches. While it's in his throat and he touches something. And so, if a bird is a nevela, then it will cause tum'ah. However, this milika, if milika is done properly, then for sure, properly means a consecrated animal inside the mikdash. Also, if you do shechita of a bird that's chulin outside the mikdash, that's the proper way to make a kosher bird. That's how we eat birds today. Chulin, done properly slaughtered outside the mikdash. So either of those two ways, that's the best way. That's what you're supposed to do, and there will not be tum'ah. Now we learned from the Mishnah that if you did milika with the left hand or at night, even though it's not a valid korban, still it's called milika sufficiently so that it's not a nevela and does not cause tum'ah. Now we're going to learn a braita that expands on this and derives it. Tenor Banan. Can it be, the Baraita asks, that if someone does milika inside the azara, where it's supposed to be, but he does it in an improper way, for example, with his left hand, would you say that it causes tum'ah to the clothing of a person while it's in his throat? Maybe it should cause tum'ah because it's an invalid korban. So you might say the milika is totally invalid. Talmud omar nevela. No, that's why the pasuk says nevela. We're talking about this pasuk here called nefesh shetochal nevela utrefa. The rabbis derived that this pasuk is talking about a bird and says it's if a nevela utrefa, then it will cause tum'ah. And so the Gemara right now says, well, that's only if it's a nevela, meaning if it dies in some other way. But this got milika, so therefore it's not called a nevela and does not cause tum'ah. Now we ask about that. Hanamen nebelahi. What do you mean? This is a nebela. It's true, it got milika by a kohen, but it was done in an improper way. It was done with his left hand, and it's not a korban. So since the milika is not effective to make it a proper korban, so why don't we call that a nebela? It died in an improper way. Didn't get shechita, and the milika is an improper milika. Ela Talmud omar terefa. Ma terefa she'en materet et ha'isur, afkan she'en materet ha'isur. This is okay, you're right. We can't learn it from the word nebela, but we can learn it from the word terefa, which is back to back in that pasuk. And the word terefa we'll discuss more. Literally, terefa means it's torn apart by an animal. Now, terefa can't mean that precisely because then that would be nebela. I mean, in other words, a terefa, if it's just that it's sick and is going to die, but it didn't die yet. So it's not tameh while it's alive. So what do you mean? Only once it dies? But once it dies in some way other than milika and shechita, then it's called nebela. So that's just nebela means something that died in a different way. So therefore, terefa is an extra word. What is terefa coming to teach us? It's coming to teach us this, that just like terefa does not make the prohibited permitted. In other words, terefa is always not kosher, no matter what. So too, this comes to include anything that does not make the prohibited permitted. Yasa milika shehi lifnim ho'il v'hi materet et ha'isur en metama begadim ve'beta beli'ah. And therefore, this word terefa will exclude our case. When you do milika melika within, even if it's done with the left hand, and it's not going to be a proper korban, nevertheless, it does permit something. It permits the law that if you would take that bird and put it on the mizbeach, you did improper melika. Now, you're not supposed to put it on the mizbeach, but let's say b'diavad, you put it on the mizbeach, you leave it there, you don't have to take it down. That much it does accomplish. When the bird was alive, you can't put it on the mizbeach at all. If you put a live bird on the mizbeach, you have to take it down. That's totally no good. But now that you did melika, even though it was an improper melika because it was done with the left hand, it's not a korban, nevertheless, it's permitted enough. It does something. It does change the status in some way that if you put it on, you don't take it down. And therefore, this is not the same as terefa. Terefa is called something where it does not accomplish anything. It was prohibited before, it was prohibited after, if it's talking about terefa. But if it's not terefa, and it does, the milika here does accomplish something, well then, it will not be called, it will not be included in nevela. That's what terefa is coming to add, that if the action that you do changes the status and permits it in some way, then we recognize that milika, even though it's done improperly, still it is called a milika, and it will not cause tum'ah. Hevi hamolek קודשים בחוץ ומולק חולין בין בפנים בין מבחוץ הואיל ואין מתירין את האיסור מטמאין בגדים הבית הבליעה. So therefore, this pasuk is going to include other cases where there is the action that you do does not make anything permitted. And that would be someone who does milika to a sacrificial animal outside of the mikdash. There, you cannot even put it on the mizbeach. That's totally bad. And so the milika accomplishes nothing, and that bird will cause tum'ah. Or if you do milika on a non-sacrificial bird anywhere, whether inside or outside, since that action of milika does not permit it in any way, you cannot put that on the altar, and if you put it on, you have to take it down. So since that milika does not permit anything, therefore that is a nevela, and that will cause tum'ah for the person if it's in his throat. Tanya idach, there is another braita that is similar to the one before, except that it focuses on shechita rather than milika, and asks, Yachol tehe shechitat cholin lifnim, vekodashim ben bibifnim, ben bibachutz metamea abet habili'a, tomodomar nevela. You might think that doing shechita for a non-sacred bird inside the mikdash, so chulin, if you do shechita outside of chulin, that's totally good. That's proper. If you do it inside, that's not proper shechita. You're not supposed to do any sacrifice shechitat chulin inside. Or kodashim, a sacrificial bird that you do shechita, you're not supposed to do shechita on a sacrificial bird, you're supposed to do milika. If instead you do shechita, whether inside the azara or outside the azara, perhaps that will cause tum'ah, because this is improper. It doesn't make it kosher. That animal, that's chulin, that bird, you cannot eat, and this, the sacrificial bird, you cannot offer. So since all these are improper shechitas, you might think that bird will cause tum'ah. Therefore, Talmud omar nebela, that's why the pasuk says nebela, only if it died in some other way, but this got shechita, and therefore it's not tameh. Now we ask, Haname nebelahi. What do you mean? This is included in nebela. It's true, it got shechita, but it was improper shechita, the wrong place or the wrong type of bird to get shechita, and therefore we should consider the shechita the same as if it was just torn apart. So why don't we say it is a nevela and causes tumah? Ela temodomar terefa, ma terefa shava bifnim kebachutz, af kol shavot bifnim kabachutz. Therefore, the pasuk adds the word terefa. What is the word terefa coming to add? It seems like an extra word. If it died If it was torn apart literally, to the literal word meaning of the word terefa, well then that's already nevela. So what is terefa coming to add? It's coming to limit the tum'ah status only to something where if you did that action inside or outside, it would be the same. If something's a terefa, it's torn apart inside or outside the Bet HaMikdash, it's the same law. It's not kosher either way. So too, any action that is equal inside and outside will be tameh. But if there's a distinction between inside and outside, then it will be tahor. Because if there's some distinction between doing that action inside and outside, it means that that action is legally significant. Even if it's not totally proper, it certainly is legally significant, and if it's recognized as a significant form of killing, then it will not be tameh. So let's go through each of these three examples and see how it's different inside and outside. Yasa shechitat chulin bifnim. So shechita of chulin bifnim is inside is certainly different from outside. If you do shechita of chulin outside, it's kosher. That's the best way to treat a chulin. That's how you eat it. But inside, it's not kosher. So that clearly makes a difference. And therefore, even though you did it inside and it's not kosher, nevertheless, the fact that you did shechita on chulin is a significant legal act, sufficient to make it not tameh. וכדשים בין מבפנים בין מבחוץ, הואיל ולא שבו בפנים כבחוץ, אין מטמאים בגדים בית הבליעה. And so we're going to discuss all three. Kodashim also, whether it's inside and outside or outside, you can do shechita. Since it's not the same law inside and outside, it does not cause tum'ah while it's in the person's throat. Okay, now we'll go through each of the three. Bishlama cholin lo shavu bifnim kebachutz. Okay, as we just said, cholin is not the same inside and outside because outside is kosher, inside is not kosher. Ela kodashim idi v'idi pisulininhu. If you do shechita on a sacrificial bird, then it's not a valid sacrifice. Doesn't matter where it is. Even though you did it inside, you did shechita instead of milika. So it seems like there's no difference between inside and outside. So this doesn't fit the criteria that we said over here. Amar Rava, so instead of us says, actually, I have to give a different explanation for one of these things. Im ho'ila lo shechitat chutz l'chayebo karet, lo to'il lo letahara mideh nebela. Regarding shechita of a consecrated bird outside, one gets karet for that. It's called shechitat chutz. If you take a sacrificial bird and you stab it to death outside, you don't get karet, because that's not a normal way of killing something that would be a sacrificial act. But if you do shechita on a sacrificial bird outside, since that is generally considered a way that you kill something for an idol or for a sacrifice, but you did it outside, that's shechitat chutz, and one gets karet. So since we recognize it as a legally significant act to get karet, so then also we consider it a legally significant act that it's tahor and not it's tahor and will not be a nevela. And so therefore we see that there is a difference between slaughtering something outside versus inside. That outside you'd get karet, and inside you would not get karet for a sacrificial bird that you do shechita. Ashkehan chutz panim minelan hoil velo shavu bifnim kebachutz. Okay, so now we know that for the outside one will not, it's not tameh because the shechitat chutz is legally significant for karet. Therefore, if one did shechita of a sacrificial bird outside, that's called a legally significant act and recognized sufficiently that it will not be tameh. And now, once we know that, so then we see that there is a distinction between outside and inside, because doing shechita outside versus inside is a different law. Outside you get karet, inside you don't get karet. Since there's a difference between them, then therefore the word terefa comes to say that we recognize that as a legally significant act and is not called a nebela and is tahor. If so, how about doing milika of a sacrificial animal outside? There we should say also that it is not going to be tahor, because doing it outside and inside is not the same. If you do milika inside, it's totally kosher sacrifice. If you do it outside, it's not a kosher sacrifice. So therefore, should we say that doing a milika from outside is also going to be not tameh? אמר רב שמעי בר אשה, דנין דבר שלא בהכשרו מדבר שלא בהכשרו, ואין דנין דבר שלא בהכשרו מדבר שבהכשרו. Rav Shimi bar Asher says, no, we will not accept this conclusion because we do compare something that is not kosher to something else that is not kosher. Meaning that if you do shechita on a sacrificial bird, outside and inside, both of those are not kosher sacrifices. That's where we compare them and we see, well, is there any distinction? Does it have a different status outside and inside? And so if there's a different status, then we say, oh, see, that's a legally significant act, and we can learn that they're not tameh. However, we do not learn something by comparing something that is improper to something that is properly done, that is kosher. Milika, when it's done inside, is totally kosher, and when it's done outside, is not kosher. Well, that's because you did milika properly inside, so the fact that you did it outside and it's not proper does not make it a legally significant act, because that's you cannot opposing two things that are not kosher sacrifices, but oh look, there's a difference, so that means that it's illegally significant even though it's not valid. Here, you're comparing something valid to something invalid. So it could be that the one you did inside, milika, that's valid. The one you did outside is totally not valid. That's why it's no good. I mean, if you said stabbing it to death is outside, is no good, yeah, because that also is a different law, but that wouldn't make it pure. So you can't compare something that makes it valid to something that makes it invalid. Velo v'hatanya minayin le'yoseh she'im ala lo yered sharei yoseh kasher bebama. Wait, is that true that we never compare something that will make it a valid korban to something that would make it an invalid korban? We do in this baraita, where it says if you take sacrificial meat and you take it outside of the mikdash, then it becomes an invalid korban, and you shouldn't put it on the mizbech lechetechila. But if you did, then you don't have to take it down. You know why? Because in the time of Bamot, it was valid. Now, the time of Bamot, that was valid to have meat outside. That's the definition of Bama. That is outside of the Mikdash. So now we're learning something invalid. The invalid is you took sacrificial meat from the Mikdash outside, and we're learning a law about something invalid, that you can leave it on the mizbech from something that is valid. So over here we do learn something invalid from valid. Tana azot Torat ha'olah riba samich le. No, in that case, we're not really learning it from the law of Bama. We're actually learning it from the pasuk of Zot Torat ha'olah. Torat ha'olah means that there are things that can be raised up to the mizbeach and that stay there. Zot is a limiting word, meaning not everything. And so then we know that some things that are invalid you can leave up there, and some things are so invalid you have to take them down. And then when we're trying to figure out which fits into this category and that category, so then we use the Bama in order to define the law. But we're not actually deriving the law from Bama, we're just using the similarity to Bama to define what we learn actually from this pasuk, and therefore we conclude that, in fact, no, you don't learn something valid from something invalid, and therefore we reject this challenge. The next Mishnah teaches Malak v'nimset terefa. Rabbi Meir omer eno metameh bebet habeli'ah. Rabbi Yehuda omer metameh. If someone the Kohen takes a sanctified bird and does milika, that's what he's supposed to do. But then afterwards he looks and finds that it was a terefa, meaning it had a disease and was not healthy, and therefore is not kosher, is not a valid korban. And now the question is does it cause tum'ah? Rabbi Meir says, no, it does not cause tum'ah when it's in the person's throat, because he did milika properly. And so milika removes it from the status of being nebela. It is terefa, it's not kosher, but it does not cause tum'ah. Rabbi Yehuda omer metameh. Rabbi Yehuda says the milika does not help you. Okay, great, you did milika, but look, it's a terefa. It's no good, and therefore it does cause tum'ah, and the milika does not help. Let's see Rabbi Meir's argument. Amar Rabbi Meir, Kal v'chomer im niblat behema shemetamea b'maga u'b'masa shechitata metaheret terefata mitum'ata. We will learn the Kal v'chomer from an animal. if you have an animal that is nevela of an animal, which causes tum'ah in touching it or carrying it. So therefore, a behema, an animal nevela, it died in some other way, not through shechita, that has a high level of tum'ah, very susceptible to tum'ah, because it transmits tum'ah even with touching or carrying. Shechitata meteret terefata mitumata. Here's the key, that when you do shechita on an animal, you did proper shechita, even if you go and check its lungs, its insides afterwards, and you find it's a terefa and would not have lived 12 months, and therefore is not kosher, nevertheless, it's not tameh as a nevela. Or as a terefa, because you did shechita, so shechita removes it from its tum'ah status, even though it's not kosher, even though it's terefa. So therefore, niblata of sheno metameh b'maga u'basa, enodin shete shechitato metaret terefato mitum'ato, nebela of a bird, which is not mitameh. It does not transmit tum'ah by touching and by carrying, but only by being in the throat. So therefore, it is less contagious in terms of tum'ah. So then all the more so, when you do proper shechita on a bird, that should make it valid. That should make it tahor, even if it's found to be terefa. Okay, this kal vachomer will work regarding shechita, because for an animal, that's the only way to properly slaughter it, whether it's sanctified or not, is through shechita. And so just like for an animal where it's a high level of transmission of tum'ah, the shechita removes its tum'ah status, even if it's terefa. So to a bird, shechita will remove its tum'ah status. Mama sinu b'shechitato, shehi machshadta la'achila, umteret terefato mitum'ato, af milikato shehi machshadato ba'achila, tetehet terefato mideh tum'ato. And now a second step to the Bimeir's derivation. And now that we've seen with this kal vachomer, now we can compare shechita of a bird and milika of a bird. So just like when we have shechita of a bird, that makes it kosher to eat. A regular bird, a non-sanctified bird, you can make it kosher to eat. And if it turns out to be terefa, it's not kosher, but it's not tameh. So too, milika should be the same, because milika for a sanctified bird also makes it permitted to eat. Like if it's a chatat offering, then you do milika and you sprinkle the blood, and then you can eat the rest. So too, it should be similar, and milika should make it tahor, even if it turns out to be terefa. The milika should remove it from being tameh. That's the Bimeir's two-step argument. Rabbi Yosef Omer, Daya keniblat behema shechitata metaharta velo melikata. Rabbi Yosef, however, says no, you cannot make a two-step argument because of the principle of dayo. Dayo principle means that you cannot learn from a source more than the source itself says. And here, the source is an animal shechita by animal, and therefore you can only learn one step, that just like shechita of an animal removes its impurity, even if it's terefa, so too shechita of a bird. That's it. But daya, it's sufficient to learn that it'll be like a nevela of a behema, that the shechita makes it tahor, but you cannot then derive further about the milika, and therefore the Rabbi Yosef challenges Rabbi Meir's double derivation all the way from nevela of an animal to milika of a bird. That's too far. Now we ask, how about Rabbi Meir? What would he answer this? Does he not agree with the principle of dayo? He must. We see that the principle of dayo comes from the Torah itself. In this example, the Tanya, Midin kal vachomer kesad, vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'abi hayarok yarak befaneha vegomer, kal vachomer l'shchina 14 yom. Where do we find the principle of kal vachomer? In the Torah itself, where Hashem rebukes Miriam for saying negative things about Moshe. And Hashem tells Moshe, if a father would spit in the face of his daughter and to rebuke her in shame, then she would have to hide in shame for 7 days. That would be a punishment. That seems to be an ancient practice, that a father who officially rebuked his daughter, she would have to be sent away, be closed up for 7 days. So you would think to make a kal vachomer, if that's true for a father and a daughter, all the more so, Shekhinah, the rebuke of Shekhinah to a person should be even greater, and perhaps that would mean that Miriam should exit the camp and be excluded for 14 days. However, Torah does not say that. Rather, it says also she is excluded for 7 days. Why? Because it is enough, sufficient, that the thing that is learned from a kal vachomer cannot be more stringent than the source from which you learned it. And since we're learning the source here from a human father, therefore, even though there's reason to think that Shekhinah's rebuke would be more, but you cannot impose a greater punishment than the source. And now this is in the Torah itself, and therefore Rabbi Meir surely agrees with the principle of Dayah. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Abin, Rabbi Meir kera ashkach v'kadarash. Rather, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Abin says that Rabbi Meir actually learned his principle from a pasuk as follows: Zot Torat behema ve'ha'of. V'chi be'ezo Torah shavta behema le'of ve'of libhema. Pasuk says this is the law regarding animals and birds. Well, in what way is there the same law? That's in what issue is the law the same regarding birds and animals and birds and animals, both ways? Behema mitamea b'maga b'masa, of eno mitamea b'maga b'masa. It can't be the way that they transmit impurity, because an animal transmits impurity by touching and carrying, but a bird does not transmit impurity if someone touches or carries it. Of mitameh begadim abeta beli'ah, behema ena mitameh begadim abeta beli'ah. If someone has a piece of impure bird in his throat, then anything he's wearing and touching becomes tameh. However, for animal meat, that's not true. If just because it's in his throat, that does not transfer tum'ah to the clothing that he's wearing. So it's not the same. Both ways is not the same. Ela lomar lecha. So what is this pasuk teaching us? In what way should they be the same? Ma behema davar shemachshira le'echila metaher terefata mitum'ata af of davar shemachshir ba'achila metaher terefato mitum'ato. Rather, it teaches us that just like regarding an animal, a kosher animal, something that makes it permitted to eat, meaning shechita, will make it tahor, even if it turns out to be a terefa animal, it will not transfer tum'ah. So too regarding a bird. Anything that makes it kosher to eat, and anything that makes it kosher to eat, that includes both shechita for a non-sacred animal and milika for a non-sacred bird, and milika for a sacred bird. Those are both things that make it permissible to eat. So too, either of those, shechita or milika, will make it tahor and will not transmit tumah, even if it turns out that it was a terefa. And so that is Rabbi Meir's source for his law. Rabbi Yehuda mai ta'ama. Now, what is the source for Rabbi Yehuda, who says that milika, if you do milika and it turns out to be a terefa, it does transfer tum'ah. Kerash kach v'kadarash. Rabbi Yehuda also learns it from this pasuk that says nebela terefa. Amar Rabbi Yehuda terefa lama ne'emra. Im terefa haya hare nebela amura. Im terefa ena haya hare hi bichlal nebela. Why does the pasuk talk about nebela and terefa regarding a bird? Rabbi Yehuda wonders, terefa, why do I need terefa? If a terefa can live and this bird is alive, well then it's not going to be tameh, because because the pasuk says it has to be nevela, which means it has to be dead. So it's not going to be tameh when it's alive. And if a terefa animal is so sick that it cannot live and it's dead, well then, if died without proper slaughter, then that's going to be the same as nevela. So it's already included in nevela. So what is the word terefa coming to add? Ela lehavi terefa sheshehata shemetamea. Rather, it's coming to include this law that Rabbi Yehuda teaches, that if you have a terefa bird and you did shechita, but turns out, it's terefa, it does cause tum'ah. That's Rabbi Yehuda's source for his opinion that we cited in the Mishnah. However, we're going to challenge this derivation. Amar le Rav Shizbi, ela me'ata dichtib, v'chelib nebela, v'chelib terefa. This pasuk is talking about animals, not birds. Now, we know that for the Yehuda, even the Yehuda would agree that when it comes to an animal, if you did shechitan an animal and it turns out to be terefa, it is tahor. So he only says his opinion that's stringent regarding birds. Okay, we're going to see from this derivation that if you follow through with that same methodology, it says nevela and terefa back to back, and you apply that same methodology to this pasuk regarding animals, then you're going to end up saying that animal also that is shechita and terefa is going to be tameh, but that's not a true conclusion. Okay, so let's see how this works. Hatam name nema im terefa chaya hare nebela amura im terefa ena chaya harehi bichlal nebela. This pasuk is teaching that even if an animal is a nebela, and so therefore the most of the meat is tameh, the cheleb, which is prohibited in any case, that is meat that would be sacrificed, the cheleb is tahor. Now, you can't eat it because it's cheleb, so obviously you can't eat it, but the point is that it doesn't transmit tum'ah. That's what this pasuk says, that the cheleb of nevela and cheleb of terefa is tahor, even though the rest of the meat is tameh. Now, why do you have to tell me anything about terefa? If a terefa can live, so then it's alive. So then it can't be tameh because it talks about nebela, it has to be dead. And if a terefa cannot live and it's already dead, that's included in the category of nebela already. So what does the word terefa coming to include? Ela lahabi terefa sheshehata shechelba tahor mekelal dehi metamea. So it must be that the cheleb terefa is coming to teach me that if I have a terefa and I did shechita, that the fat is tahor. That's what it's coming to teach, that the fat of a terefa is tahor. Well then, that would mean that only the fat is tahor and the rest of the meat is tameh. So you're going to come to a conclusion that according to the Yehuda, yeah, really? If you did shechita on an animal that turns out to be a terefa, the meat is tameh, but the Yehuda does not think that. Nobody thinks that. V'ha'amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav, v'amri la b'matnita tana, v'chi amut min ha'behema, miksat behema mitamea. Rav taught the following derivation, and some say it's a baraita, that says if there should die from among animals, meaning that there are some animals that will cause tumah when they die. Miksat behema ena mitamea. But there are some animals that are not tameh when they die. Ve'ezo zo terefa sheshehata. So what is an animal that is not tameh when it dies? Oh, that's something that you did shechita and it turns out to be terefa. So it's because you did shechita, all of the animal is tahor, and Rabbi Yehuda agrees with that as well. And therefore, this entire method of derivation is going to be problematic. What is it going to do with the word terefa? אלא טרפה מבעלה למהות טמאה. מי שיש במינה טרפה, יעשתה זו שאין במינה טרפה. Rather, the word terefa in the pasuk regarding the animal fat must be required by the Yehuda in order to exclude a non-kosher animal. Temeah here is referring to a non-kosher animal, which is a bit confusing because we're talking about whether its fat is tameh or tahor, but this word temeah is not about being tameh, but rather a non-kosher animal. So we need it for a non-kosher animal, and the word terefa would teach you that this law applies to a species, a type of animal where there is such a thing as terefa, which is only in kosher species is there such a distinction. That would exclude non-kosher animals where there is no distinction between terefa and not terefa. And therefore it will teach us that for only the cheleb is tahor only for a kosher animal, but a non-kosher animal, the cheleb is tameh. So if you use terefa for that law, then hachinameh lemute of tameh shen b'mino terefa. So regarding the pasuk for birds, we can say that the word terefa is coming to exclude non-kosher birds. That a non-kosher bird, where there is no distinction between terefa and not terefa for non-kosher birds, and therefore non-kosher birds are not going to be tameh. So we have something to learn. We have a use for terefa. No, but we say Rabbi Yehuda would not need the word terefa for that because of tameh Rabbi Yehuda mi nebela nafkale. Rabbi Yehuda will learn that a non-kosher bird does not become tameh from the word nebela as follows. Detanya Rabbi Yehuda omer yachol tehe niblat of tameh metamah begadim abet habeli'ah. You may think that a dead non-kosher bird will cause tum'ah to someone who's wearing clothes if to the clothes of a person who's wearing it if the dead bird, a piece of it, is in his throat. So we might think that even a non-kosher bird causes tumah. Talmud omar nebela utrefa lo yochal. Pasuk says, do not eat nebela and terefa. Misheisuru mishum bal tochal nebela. This must apply only to a type of species that there is a prohibition of eating it because it's nebela. That's only true for kosher birds. But non-kosher birds are prohibited because they're not kosher, not because of nebela. Ela mishum bal tochal tameh. Rather, their non-kosher birds are prohibited because they are not kosher, and you're not allowed to eat non-kosher birds. And therefore, we can learn from this word, nebela, in this pasuk, that non-kosher birds are not going to become tameh. That leaves the word terefa free to derive Rabbi Yehuda's original derivation for his law, as we said above. But now we challenge this too. Hainameh tepok li me cheleb nebela. The law that the cheleb of a non-kosher animal is tameh, we can learn from this pasuk cheleb nebela as follows: Mi she'isuro mishum bal tochal cheleb nebela, yatztazo she'en isura mishum bal tochal cheleb nebela, ela mishum tameh. Above we learned it from the continuation of pasuk cheleb nebela vecheleb terefa. But actually, you wouldn't have to learn it from cheleb terefa. You could just learn it from cheleb nebela, because we could say this the same methodology that we applied above. In a case where the prohibition is because cheleb nebela, then the cheleb will be tahor, even though the meat is tameh. That will exclude a species of animal that is prohibited not because of cheleb nebela, but rather because it's not kosher. So that will be excluded from this law, and therefore we can derive that the cheleb of a non-kosher animal is tameh. And since I can learn that from cheleb nebela, now cheleb terefa is extra. What am I going to do with it? Ela hay terefa mi ba'ale le'atuye haya. Rather, according to the Yehuda, the word terefa in this pasuk is coming to include a haya, because for a chaya, the law is that the regular meat and the cheleb is permitted. Since a chaya cannot be sacrificed, so it doesn't have sacrificial parts. So the cheleb, in a case of chaya, is permitted to eat. So I need a pasuk to include chaya in this law. Why? Salkada techamina mishechelba asur ubsara mutar. Perhaps only for a behema, where the cheleb is prohibited and the basar is permitted. So that's where I say that in that case, the cheleb is tahor and the meat is tameh. Yasat zo shechelba ubsara mutar kamash malan. So I might think to exclude the chaya, where both the cheleb and the basar are permitted. So maybe I would say that everything in the chaya is tameh. No, kamash malan, this comes to teach me that we apply the same distinction for a chaya also, that the meat is tameh, but the cheleb is tahor. Amar le. Some take out the words amar le because it just seems like the Gemara is saying this, not part of a conversation. But rather, we're challenging this result. Mai shena teme'ah. How is haya different from a non-kosher animal? Right? Why should there be a distinction in the laws between each? De'en chelba haluk me besara. Chaya nameh en chelba haluk me besara. For a non-kosher animal, there is no distinction between its fat and its meat. Both are prohibited. Regarding a chaya also, there is no distinction between the cheleb fat and the rest of the meat, and that both are permitted to eat. So why would you say that when it comes to a chaya, that has the same law as an animal, and the meat is tameh, but the cheleb is tahor? But when it comes to a non-kosher animal, the cheleb is going to be tameh. Why should you make any distinction between a non-kosher animal and a chaya? Isn't a distinction between the making something tahor and tameh be related to the fact that in a behemah, some of it, what's kosher is tameh, what's non-kosher is tahor. So there should be a difference. It's because of the difference in being able to eat it that triggers a difference in tumah. But here, there's no difference in the permission or prohibition to eat it. Furthermore, this pasuk says that we're going to interpret it on the next daf, that the fat of chaya is tameh. So in fact, the fat is tameh. And so this conclusion is totally wrong. Rather, Abaye will explain that according to the Biuda, we need the word terefa when it comes to cheleb terefa regarding an animal, is required for its own context. Lo tomar ho'il utmea asura mechayim, utrufa asura mechayim, ma temea chelba tameh, af terefa chelba tameh. Without the pasuk, you could reason, since a non-kosher animal is prohibited even when it's alive. The second is born, it's defined as a non-kosher animal, and therefore is always going to be prohibited to eat. And terefa also is prohibited even while it's alive. In other words, it's not because it was killed in the wrong way. Even while it's alive, it's considered sick and is already prohibited. And therefore, since they are the same in that way, I might compare them and derive the one law from the other and say, just like for a non-kosher animal, the cheleb is tameh, also for terefa, the cheleb is tameh. And that's why I need this pasuk to say, cheleb terefa is tahor. Otherwise, I wouldn't know that. So I need this pasuk for its own context. That will explain, according to Biyuda, why I need this pasuk. But we reject Abaye. Yachi, hai name mi ba'eh, shelo tomar ho'il ve'od tameh, ve'of tameh asur b'achila, utrefa asura b'achila, ma'of tameh eno mitameh, af terefa ena mitameh. Then you're going to use the same logic for the pasuk that Rabbi Yehuda is learning his main law regarding birds. Then we'll say that word teme'ah is not extra to derive Rabbi Yehuda's law, but rather I would need it for its own context. Because without this pasuk, and without the word teme'ah, terefa, I would think, just like of tahor, of tameh, a non-kosher bird is prohibited to eat, and a terefa bird is also prohibited to eat. So I would compare them and say, just like a tameh bird does not cause tum'ah, so to a terefa bird does not cause tum'ah. And that's why I need the pasuk teme'ah to teach me that a terefa bird does cause tum'ah. And therefore this pasuk will not be extra to teach the law of the Biyuda. And therefore we're stuck. For Abaye, we have no, we're stuck. Even according to Abaye, we have no pasuk that we don't have a word terefa that's extra in order to teach me the law of Rabbi Yehuda. And then we ask a further question against Abaye. Why would you even think that you should derive the law of a terefa from teme'ah? Teme'ah lo hayta shata kosher. Teme'ah, a non-kosher bird, was never, or animal, was never kosher. It had no time at which it might have been kosher to eat, because it's born as a non-kosher species. Terefa hayta la shata kosher, but something that is sick, before it got an injury, it was a kosher bird, and it could have been slaughtered and eaten, or animal. And if you say, well, there is such a thing as a terefa that's born with a birth defect, that it was already terefa its whole life, yeah, but bemina mihaika, but there is such a thing as some terefa animals that were born healthy and then became unhealthy. So therefore, the comparison that Abaye made to begin with was not a comparison, and one would not have thought that. Ela amar Rava. Rather, Rava will finally explain why we need the extra term cheleb teme'ah according to the Biuda, and if we can explain that, then that will answer Rav Shizbi's question that we had all the way back here above. Rav Shizbi asked if you're going to apply this nebela terefa, if you're going to use this methodology, then what are you going to do with the word cheleb terefa? Okay, so if we can solve this one, then the Biuda's original derivation can be left standing. And so here is how Rava explains it. HaTorah amra, yavo isur nebela v'yachol al isur cheleb. The Torah, the reason why it says cheleb nebela and cheleb terefa is to teach me that if you have something that is a nebela, the meat of the animal is nebela, and also the cheleb is prohibited as nebela. So that if someone eats the cheleb of a nebela animal, they'll be liable on 2 counts, both because it's cheleb and because it's nebela. Yavo isur terefa v'yachol al isur cheleb. And furthermore, if an animal is a terefa and he eats the meat, he violates terefa, and if he eats the cheleb of that animal, he violates 2 counts, terefa and cheleb. That's what this pasuk is coming to teach me. Usrichi. Now I need both. I couldn't derive one from the other because each one, nebela and terefa, have a leniency and a stringency. Diashmina nebela mishum de mitamiya about terefa emala. If you told me that nebela applies both to the regular meat and the cheleb, I would say that's because nebela is mitameh, but terefa in an animal is not tameh. And therefore, I would say that the stringency would not apply. So that's why you have to tell me that terefa applies both to the meat and to the cheleb. V'yashminan terefa, and if the pasuk only tells me terefa, mishum disura mechayim, terefa is prohibited already while it's alive. Aval nevela emala, but nevela only becomes prohibited once it dies, and so I might not apply the stringency that applies to cheleb also to nevela. That's why it has to tell me nevela also, sericha, so that's why I need both of these. And now that Rava was able to explain the pasuk regarding why we need cheleb terefa regarding an animal, so then that removes the challenge of Rav Shizbi, and then we can go back. The problem of Rav Shizbi is that it says if you apply this methodology to the pasuk about birds, then you're going to have to apply it to the pasuk about animals, and then we got into that complication. But once we see that we need cheleb terefa to teach me Rava's law, so then I can come all the way back here and say, according to the Biuda, how does he know that if you have a teref, if you do shechita, and on a bird, and you find out it's terefa, it still remains tameh, and the shechita does not remove it. So back what he said over here, terefa, why does it have to say terefa? What is terefa coming to add? Oh, it's an extra word that comes to include a terefa. Even though you did shechita on that bird, it is still tameh. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.